Have you ever wondered if a tiny purple berry could hold the secret to a sharper memory and a more vibrant life after 60? In today's video, we'll uncover the incredible power of blueberries and reveal the 3 foods you should never eat with them. Join us for an inspiring story of how one simple habit changed a man's life forever. If you find this information helpful, please hit that like button to support us and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more secrets to living a longer, healthier life. Now, let's begin. The dust motes danced in the gloom of the study as Arthur Vance sat clutching a book, the name of a Renaissance painter eluding him like a ghost. The frustration was a familiar, dull pressure behind his eyes. His world, once a vast library of knowledge, was shrinking into a collection of locked rooms. The telephone's sharp ring was an unwelcome intrusion. It was Robert, his son, his voice a polished blend of love and clinical impatience. "Dad, you missed your neurologist appointment again," Robert began, wasting no time. "We need a plan. There's a new medication, and I've been looking into a wonderful community, Cedarbrook Meadows. It's not a home, Dad, it's security." The word landed like a judgment. Security, a polite term for a gilded cage. "I am perfectly fine," Arthur snapped, the lie tasting like ash. "This conversation is over." He hung up, his hand trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The walls of his fortress-like study suddenly felt claustrophobic. To escape, he drove to the local market, the bright lights and cheerful noise, an assault on his frayed nerves. As he stood staring blankly at a row of canned soups, a light tap on his shoulder made him jump. He turned to see the warm, familiar face of Margaret Shaw, a former colleague. "Arthur, how lovely to see you," she said, her smile genuine. His mind went white. He knew her name as well as his own, but it was trapped behind a wall of fog. The silence stretched, becoming a vast, humiliating canyon between them. He saw her smile falter, replaced by a look of sad, knowing pity. "It's Margaret," she supplied softly. The shame was a physical blow. Mumbling an excuse, Arthur abandoned his cart and fled the store. On his porch, he fumbled with his keys, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. As he bent to retrieve them, a flash of color from next door caught his eye. His new neighbor was kneeling in a vibrant, meticulously tended garden, a stark contrast to his own neglected yard. She looked up and offered a simple, kind wave. Arthur could only manage a curt nod before disappearing inside, locking the door behind him. He leaned against it, his heart pounding. He was safe inside his fortress again, but for the first time, he felt like a prisoner, painfully aware of the vibrant, living world just on the other side of the wall. The silence in Arthur's house grew heavy in the days that followed. It was broken only by the arrival of his granddaughter, Chloe, a burst of sunshine in his grey, self-imposed exile. Her laughter filled the dusty rooms, but even that joy was tinged with sorrow. When she asked him to retell her favorite story, a grand tale of a shipwreck he had told a dozen times, he faltered, the hero's name vanishing into the fog of his mind. His name was Samuel, Chloe corrected him gently, her innocent memory, a sharp, painful reminder of his own decline. The look in her eyes, a mixture of love and confusion, was more devastating than any doctor's diagnosis. After she left, the silence returned, now laced with the bitter taste of failure. Seeking refuge from the suffocating walls of his study, Arthur stepped out into his neglected backyard. Helen's rose bushes were thorny skeletons, the garden a perfect mirror of his own withered spirit. A soft, rhythmic sound drew his gaze to the other side of the low stone wall. It was his neighbor, Eleanor, tending to her vibrant garden. She moved with a peaceful energy that seemed to belong to a different world. "Those roses have good bones," she said, her voice carrying easily on the still air, not looking up from her work. "They just need a little encouragement to bloom again." He said nothing, simply watching as she stood and walked toward him, a kind smile on her face. She held out a small ceramic bowl filled with tiny, deep blue jewels. "From my garden," she offered. "A gift." "Oh." He took the bowl, the weight of it a small, solid comfort in his hands. "They're nature's brain food, you know," she added casually, her eyes twinkling, "packed with anthocyanins, wonderful for the mind." With another smile, she returned to her work, leaving him with her offering. Arthur looked down at the berries, plump and coated in a delicate silvery frost, a simple fruit against a gathering darkness. Skeptical, yet with nothing left to lose, he picked one up and placed it in his mouth. A burst of flavor, intensely sweet, surprisingly vibrant, and defiantly alive, awakened his senses. It was a different kind of harvest, and in the encroaching twilight of his life, it felt like the first ray of dawn. The taste of that single blueberry lingered, a small, bright memory against the backdrop of his recent failures. But hope, Arthur knew, was a fickle thing. It needed more than a pleasant taste to survive. It needed a foundation. The next morning, he awoke to a familiar dread. It was Wednesday, the day of his weekly video call with Chloe. The computer screen felt like a final exam he hadn't studied for, a test of his lucidity that he was increasingly certain to fail. The call began well. Chloe showed him a drawing of a dragon, and he managed to ask coherent questions about it. But then, she asked him to read her the first chapter of the book they had started together the previous week. He opened the file on his computer, but the words on the screen seemed to swim. He stumbled over names, his reading halting and disjointed. After a few painful minutes, a small icon appeared in the corner of the screen. Robert had joined the call. "Everything all right, Dad?" his son asked, his voice carefully neutral, but Arthur could hear the underlying clinical assessment. He saw the flicker of disappointment on Chloe's face as she listened to her grandpa struggle. That was it. That was the tipping point. The thought of being a source of disappointment for his granddaughter was a weight too heavy to bear. After the call ended, Arthur sat motionless for a long time, the silence of the study pressing in on him. Then, with a resolve he hadn't felt in years, he stood up, picked up the empty ceramic bowl from the day before, and walked out his back door. He found Eleanor pruning a lavender bush. She looked up as he approached the stone wall, a question in her eyes. He swallowed his pride, the words feeling foreign and difficult. "Tell me more about the blueberries," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Tell me everything." A slow, understanding smile spread across Eleanor's face. She set down her shears and beckoned him toward her kitchen door. "Come in, Arthur. Let's have some tea." Her kitchen was the complete opposite of his study. It was bright, airy, and filled with life. Pots of herbs lined the windowsill, and sunlight streamed in, illuminating the cheerful yellow walls. As the kettle whistled, she laid out the foundation of her philosophy. "It wasn't magic," she explained, "but simple, powerful science. The first thing is consistency," she began, placing 2 mugs on the table. "A handful every single day, about 30 of them. That's enough to start rebuilding those neural shields." Then came the rules, the crucial details he needed to unlock their full potential. She explained them with the simple clarity of a seasoned teacher. "First, no cow's milk with your berries," she said, pouring hot water over the tea bags. "It's a surprise to most people. The proteins in dairy can bind to the antioxidants, the very things we're after. Your body can't absorb them properly. If you like them with oatmeal or in a smoothie, try a plant-based milk. Oat milk is lovely and creamy." She then warned him about a surprising culprit. "And as healthy as they are, avoid eating cucumbers at the same time. They contain a specific enzyme that actually breaks down the vitamin C in the berries before your body gets a chance to use it. Save them for your salad later in the day." Finally, she pointed to a pineapple sitting on her counter. "And that one. Wonderful for digestion, but very acidic. When you combine it with the acidity of blueberries, it can be too much for a sensitive stomach. Give them at least an hour apart." It all made a strange, logical sense. It wasn't a vague instruction to eat healthy, but a clear, actionable plan. It was a strategy. It was something he could control. "I'll try it," he said, looking her directly in the eye. "For 1 month, religiously." That evening, Arthur bought a carton of fresh blueberries, a bottle of oat milk, and a new, leather-bound journal. On the first page, he wrote the date and a single sentence. "The 30-berry pact begins." His entry was filled with the heavy ink of doubt, but beneath it, almost too small to see, was the delicate, hopeful stroke of a new beginning. The first week of the pact was an exercise in pure discipline. Every morning, Arthur measured out his portion of blueberries, ate them with his oat milk oatmeal, and made a note in his journal. Nothing changed. The fog was still there, the names were still just out of reach, and the frustration was a constant companion. He felt a fool. But in the second week, something shifted. It was almost imperceptible at first. He was working on the Sunday crossword puzzle, a ritual he had nearly abandoned. He came to a clue: Botticelli's famous Venus. Without hesitation, the name Sandro flowed from his mind to the tip of his pen. He stared at the completed word, a small jolt of surprise running through him. It was a minor victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He circled the word in his journal that night. A few days later, he ran into Margaret Shaw again, this time at the post office. He saw her, and before the panic could set in, her name surfaced, clear and bright. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you," he said, and the warmth in his voice was genuine. The look of surprise and pleasure on her face was better than any medicine. He began taking morning walks, initially just to get out of the house. He often saw Eleanor in her garden, and soon their walks became a shared routine. They would stroll along the rocky coastline of Seabrook, the salty air invigorating him. Their conversations were a perfect exchange. He would tell her about the architectural history of the old sea captains' houses they passed, and she would point out the resilient coastal flora, naming each plant and explaining its properties. He found himself engaged, curious, and intellectually stimulated in a way he hadn't been in years. The world, it seemed, was slowly coming back into focus. Robert's weekly call became a new source of tension. "I heard from Margaret Shaw," his son said one Tuesday. "She said you seemed sharp." There was a note of surprise in his voice that irked Arthur. "I'm feeling better, Robert." "That's great, Dad, but you still need to see Dr. Matthews. We can't rely on breakfast fruit for a long-term strategy." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Robert, with his deep faith in prescriptions and peer-reviewed studies, saw Arthur's new regimen as a foolish distraction, a dangerous detour from the path of modern medicine. Arthur didn't argue. He knew words would not convince his son. He simply continued his daily ritual. The 30 berries, the morning walk, and the nightly entries in his journal, which were now filled with more triumphs than frustrations. The slow thaw had begun, and he was determined to see what spring would feel like. The third week of October brought a change in the weather. A damp, persistent chill swept in from the Atlantic, and with it came the seasonal flu. Arthur, who had felt more robust than he had in years, was caught completely off guard. The illness hit him hard, confining him to his bed with a fever and a deep, rattling cough. Worse than the physical symptoms was the return of the fog. It descended with a vengeance, thicker and more disorienting than before. His thoughts felt sluggish and disconnected. He would wake from a feverish sleep, not knowing if it was day or night. All his progress, all the small victories he had so carefully recorded in his journal, felt like a distant, mocking dream. His new hope was fragile, and the storm of the illness threatened to extinguish it completely. Robert, of course, insisted on driving up from the city. He arrived not just as a son, but as a physician, his medical bag in hand, and a grim, vindicated look on his face. He took Arthur's temperature, listened to his lungs, and wrote out several prescriptions. "This is what I was worried about, Dad," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're vulnerable here on your own." He placed a glossy brochure on the bedside table. The cover showed a smiling, silver-haired couple playing chess in a sun-drenched common room. The name was printed in elegant script: Cedarbrook Meadows. "This is the place I told you about," Robert continued, opening the brochure to a page showing floor plans for private apartments. "It's not a nursing home, it's security. It's peace of mind. For both of us. This Blueberry thing is a nice idea, but it's a fantasy. It can't protect you from this." The argument that followed was the most bitter they had ever had. Robert's clinical logic crashed against Arthur's desperate, prideful resistance. Weakened by the fever, his mind clouded and slow, Arthur felt his resolve crumbling. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe he was just a foolish old man, clinging to a handful of berries against the inevitable tide. He was exhausted, and the idea of letting someone else take over, of surrendering, was dangerously tempting. Later that afternoon, after Robert had left for the city with a promise to call and make arrangements, there was a soft knock on the back door. It was Eleanor. She held a steaming thermos and a small jar of what looked like golden honey. "I saw the doctor's car," she said simply, stepping into the kitchen. "I thought you might need some real medicine." She didn't preach about antioxidants or lecture him on natural immunity. She simply poured him a mug of rich, fragrant vegetable broth and a cup of herbal tea sweetened with the honey. She sat with him in the quiet kitchen, her calm, steady presence, a comforting anchor in his sea of doubt and confusion. "Healing isn't a straight line, Arthur," she said softly after a long silence. "The body is a remarkable thing, but it has to fight its battles. Be patient with it. The strength you've been building is still there. It's just busy right now." Her quiet faith was more powerful than all of Robert's urgent logic. It was the reinforcement he desperately needed. When his son called that evening, his voice full of efficient plans, Arthur found the strength to push back. "Not yet, Robert," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I just need a little more time." The recovery, when it came, was astonishingly swift. It was as if his body, nourished by weeks of healthful living and Eleanor's potent broths, had marshaled its forces and expelled the illness with surprising efficiency. Within a week, the fever was gone, the cough had subsided, and most remarkably, the fog had lifted. Not only did it lift, but the clarity that returned felt sharper, more defined than before the flu. He felt a deep, foundational resilience he hadn't known he possessed. One afternoon, feeling restless, he began to clean his cluttered study. In a forgotten corner, tucked behind a stack of art journals, he found a wooden box. He blew a layer of dust from its lid and opened it. Inside, nestled in their compartments, were his old watercolor paints. He hadn't touched them in at least 5 years. Not since his hands had begun to feel unsteady, and his vision had started to blur the fine details of the world. On an impulse, he took the box to the window. He looked out at the old oak tree in his backyard, its remaining leaves a brilliant, fiery orange against the crisp blue sky. And then he noticed it. He could see the intricate web of veins on a single leaf. He could distinguish the subtle shifts in color where the sunlight hit the bark. The world, which had become a soft-focus impressionist painting, had suddenly snapped back into high-definition reality. He felt an almost forgotten creative spark ignite within him. He found a block of thick watercolor paper, filled a jar with water, and sat down at his desk. His hand, as he picked up the brush, was surprisingly steady. He mixed a touch of burnt sienna with yellow ochre, and with a confidence that felt both new and ancient, he began to paint. That afternoon marked a turning point. Painting became his new pact. It was a daily measure of his progress, a joyful confirmation that his mind and body were healing in tandem. His days found a new, purposeful rhythm. Morning walks with Eleanor evolved into shared gardening sessions. He started to tackle the tangled wilderness of his own backyard, clearing weeds and pruning Helen's roses with a determined hand. The physical work felt good, and the sight of new buds on the old, thorny canes filled him with a profound sense of accomplishment. His garden, like his mind, was slowly being reclaimed. During their time together, Eleanor shared more of her botanical wisdom. He learned that walnuts, with their brain-boosting omega-3 seconds, and bananas, rich in potassium for nerve function, were powerful allies to the blueberries. His diet became richer and more varied, a tapestry of colors and nutrients. His life was no longer about managing decline, it was about cultivating growth. As summer approached, the town of Seabrook began to buzz with preparations for its annual Arts and Founders Festival. On a whim, buoyed by his newfound confidence, Arthur decided to enter. He set himself an ambitious goal, a series of 5 watercolors depicting the wild blueberry barrens of Maine, capturing the landscape as it changed through the seasons. The project consumed him. It demanded a level of focus, precision, and visual acuity he would have thought impossible just 6 months prior. His studio, once a dusty tomb, was now a vibrant workspace, filled with light, color, and the quiet energy of creation. He painted the delicate white blossoms of spring, the lush green leaves of summer under a brilliant sun, the fiery crimson of the autumn fields, and the stark, beautiful silence of the barrens under a blanket of snow. The final painting was a secret. It was a portrait of Chloe, captured from a photograph he had taken, showing her sitting in the middle of the summer field, a joyful, berry-stained smile on her face, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair. It was, he knew, the best thing he had ever painted. Robert and Chloe drove up for the festival weekend. Arthur could tell his son was bracing himself, preparing to be politely encouraging about a few amateurish paintings. When they walked into the town hall, which had been converted into a bustling gallery, Robert stopped dead in his tracks. There, on a central display wall, hung Arthur's collection. They were not the clumsy daubs of a failing old man. They were masterful. The colors were vibrant and true, the details exquisite, the compositions powerful. They radiated a life and skill that left Robert utterly speechless. Chloe, however, was not speechless. "Grandpa, it's me," she squealed, pointing at the fifth painting. She ran to it, her face alight with pure joy. That evening, the festival crowds had thinned. Robert found Arthur sitting alone on a bench, overlooking the harbor, the water shimmering under the rising moon. He sat down beside his father, the silence between them no longer strained, but filled with a new, unspoken understanding. "Dad," Robert began, his voice thick with an emotion Arthur had not heard in years. "I'm sorry." He looked out at the water, his profile etched in the moonlight. "I'm a doctor. I spend my days reading charts, analyzing data, and writing prescriptions. I'm trained to see the disease. I think I forgot to see the patient. I forgot to really look at you. Oh." He turned to Arthur, his eyes shining. "Those paintings, they're magnificent. They're the best work you've ever done." In that moment, the last of the fog cleared, not from Arthur's mind, but from the space between a father and his son. They talked for a long time, not about medicine or assisted living, but about art, about Helen, about Chloe, and about the surprising, resilient power of a handful of small blue berries. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Arthur's days were no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he was creating. The 30-berry pact was no longer a pact. It was simply a part of a life that felt richer and more vibrant than he had ever thought possible. His mornings began with a walk along the shore with Eleanor, their friendship a comfortable, essential part of his new landscape. His breakfast was a joyful ritual of oatmeal, blueberries, walnuts, and bananas. And his afternoons were spent in his sunlit studio, the scent of watercolor paint mingling with the salty sea air. He was not just a senior citizen, a widower, a patient. He was an artist, a gardener, a friend, a grandfather. He began teaching Chloe to paint. On Saturdays, she would sit beside him in the studio, her small hand mimicking his as they mixed colors. He would share a bowl of blueberries with her, telling her with a wink that they were magic paint for her brain. He was passing on the wisdom he had learned, not as a grim prescription, but as a joyful secret shared between them. The weekly calls with Robert changed too. The tension was gone, replaced by a mutual respect and a budding curiosity. One Tuesday, Robert called with a different kind of question. "Dad, I have a patient," he said, his tone thoughtful. "An older woman, very resistant to starting new medications. She's worried about the side effects, just like you were." And I found myself telling her about the proven benefits of a diet rich in antioxidants. He paused. "Eleanor's vegetable broth. Would you happen to have the recipe?" Arthur smiled. The harvest was more bountiful than he could have imagined. That afternoon he stood before a fresh, blank canvas. The fear of the future, the dread of the gathering fog, was gone. Old age was not a waiting room. It was simply another season, with its own unique light, its own challenges, and its own stark beauty. He dipped his finest brush into a deep, vibrant pool of cerulean blue. With a steady hand and a clear eye, he made the first, confident stroke. His future was no longer a void to be managed, but a canvas waiting to be filled. Thank you for joining us on Arthur's journey. We hope his story has offered a little bit of inspiration and a reminder of the powerful connection between nature, health, and the human spirit. We're so grateful to have you in our community. Until next time, stay healthy, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.